Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Matthew Eappen. Sunil and Deborah got married in 1990 after meeting in medical college. Sunil, from Chicago, USA, followed his father's path and became an anesthesiologist, while Deborah worked as an ophthalmologist. Their first child, Brendan, was born in 1994, and their second child, Matthew, born May 24, 1996. They are young parents working in the medical field. They face significant challenges balancing their careers and family life. Both came from respected families with successful backgrounds in education and medicine, motivating them to achieve similar success. They lived in a prestigious area of Boston, Massachusetts, in a lovely home and were financially comfortable enough to hire a nanny. The nanny became like a family member, handling both childcare and household duties, and lived on their property. Deborah soon returned to work part-time, having completed advanced training courses during her pregnancy. Balancing her professional responsibilities with family care was difficult and stressful. The high workload placed on the nannies often led to them leaving due to stress or being dismissed if they couldn't meet the family's expectations. Before hiring 18-year-old Louise Woodward from Cheshire, Great Britain, they used to employ 3 other nannies. Louise lived with her family until she turned 18, then decided to take a gap year in the United States before continuing her education. Although she didn't have formal training, she loved children and got along well with them. She registered as a nanny and housekeeper with a recruiting agency, which helped her move to Boston and find a job. In December 1996, she started working for the Sunil family, whose youngest child, Matthew, was only 8 months old. She had no prior experience with infants, including changing diapers, and had only 3 days of training before she began her job. Louise was given the responsibility of caring for Matthew and 2 years old, Brendan, and assisting with household chores. She quickly found the workload overwhelming due to the family's busy daily routine. All this workload went against Louise's plans, as she had come to the USA seeking adventure and enjoyment, not to work without any days off. She initially thought that being a nanny would provide her with a livelihood without much responsibility. However, looking after children aged 8 months and 2 years truly requires experience, training, and a sense of responsibility. It is challenging to expect an 18-year-old to have such expertise without proper training. Despite this, Sunil and Deborah, who were desperate for help, accepted Louise since they needed a nanny housekeeper. Furthermore, her services were affordable. However, Louise's behavior did not meet the family's high standards, so they gave her a list of rules to follow. As a young nanny, she had little choice because previous failures with other families had put her at risk of being dismissed by the agency. She needed to keep her job to maintain her income. It was challenging for her to suppress her youthful, free spirit, as she preferred to walk, chat with friends, and attend parties rather than focus on work. Occasionally, she would wander around Boston and indulge in her dreams. However, she started refusing work more often, frequently asking for time off, and spending a lot of time on herself. She began taking daily walks, returning late in the evening, regularly attending parties, and struggling to wake up in the morning, often sleeping until nearly lunchtime. This behavior disappointed the Eappens, as she would spend hours chatting with her family in the UK, neglecting her responsibilities with the children. One day, Deborah came home from work earlier than usual and found the children sleeping at home alone without any supervision. Later, the nanny Louise returned from a party. There were suspicions that similar incidents had occurred before. Naturally, Sunil and Deborah felt worried about their children and they were not happy with her. They spoke to her and imposed a curfew, but it didn't solve the problem. They were very unhappy with her behavior and felt they weren't getting their money's worth for services. Although they still wanted to trust her, they saw her as lazy and irresponsible. So, the relationship which she began to significantly deteriorate a few days before the unfortunate incident. She openly told Sunil that she didn't enjoy being a nanny and didn't want children because it was difficult, yet she pleaded not to be fired because she desperately needed the job. Sunil made more rules to discipline her, to get the nanny at the level they desired. On February 3, 1997, Deborah informed Louise that she could leave if anything was not to her liking. However, Louise, the nanny, resisted the idea, insisting there was no need to rush and that she was willing to accept and adhere to their new, stricter conditions. They agreed but mentioned they needed to change the children's sleep schedule by limiting sleep after 3 p.m. to prevent disrupting their nighttime rest. This change was not aimed at Louise personally but was necessary to reorganize the children's daily routine. Shortly after this, a terrible tragedy occurred. The tragedy happened just 10 weeks after Louise began her job. On February 4, 1997, Louise woke the children up in the morning after the parents left for work. She mentioned that Matthew was unusually fussy and cried a lot from the start of the day. Louise bathed him and then put him back to bed to calm him down. At 3:15 p.m., she went to wake him up from his nap and noticed he was breathing weakly and irregularly. She took him to the living room to perform CPR, but he remained unconscious. Initially, she couldn't reach Sunil and Deborah and only called 911 at 3:45 p.m. to report that Matthew, the 8-month-old, was not breathing. Louise informed the coordinator that the baby might have choked on vomit because his face was turning blue. Emergency services arrived quickly. The child was alive but in critical condition. The doctors rushed him to the children's hospital, where they found that Matthew had much more severe injuries than initially reported. Matthew, an 8-month-old baby, was found to have a 10-centimeter crack at the base of his skull, bleeding in his eyes, a hematoma between the skull and brain, and bleeding in his neck and back of the brain. He also had a broken wrist, and vomit was found in his trachea. He was urgently taken to the operating room for brain surgery and connected him to a life support machine because he was in a coma. Experienced doctors suggested that these injuries were caused by being violently shaken and hit on the head. In pediatrics, this is known as shaken baby syndrome. Babies are born with disproportionately large heads and weak neck muscles, making them vulnerable to injury when shaken. The unfixed head will dangle when shaken, causing damage to brain cell membranes and brain injury. When a baby is shaken, the brain moves back and forth inside the skull, leading to swelling and bleeding. Adults often shake babies out of frustration when they cry, not realizing it won't calm them down but will make them cry more. Continued shaking can cause severe injuries or even be fatal. Most cases occur in children up to 2 years old, but even a 4-year-old can suffer greatly from such shaking. Around 4 p.m., Deborah, Matthew's mother, noticed she had missed a call from Louise at 3:15 p.m. and also saw an urgent text message from she. Concerned, she left her patient at the hospital and called she, who explained the situation. Deborah was furious. She asked for leave from work and rushed to the hospital where Matthew was admitted. On the way, she prayed that her son would be okay. Upon arrival, she informed the doctors of her medical expertise, as she was an ophthalmologist, and asked to examine her baby. She quickly discovered severe Matthew's eye hemorrhaging. Meanwhile, the doctors alerted the police about the baby's serious injuries, prompting law enforcement to visit the Eappen family home to question the nanny. Louise. Louise was at home, looking upset and concerned, with Brendan. She explained that Matthew had been irritable and difficult since the morning, and despite her efforts to calm him, nothing worked. By the end of the conversation, she confessed to possibly being a bit harsh with him. Overwhelmed by his continuous crying and screaming, she shook him to try to soothe him, but it was ineffective. In frustration, she threw him onto a pile of towels on the bed. While taking him to the bathroom, she accidentally dropped him, which caused him to hit his head on the floor. Her account was alarming, given the severity of Matthew's injuries. The following day, the police arrested Louise on charges of assaulting a child. Matthew's condition was not improving, and doctors were sure he had no hope of recovery. The brain injury was so severe that, even if he survived, he would be paralyzed for life. Sunil and Deborah, who were also medically educated, understood this. On February 9, 1997, they made the difficult decision to disconnect Matthew from life support, worsening Louise's situation as she was accused of murder. She was denied bail before the trial, but continued to insist on her innocence, maintaining it was a tragic accident. Before the trial on May 7, 1997, Louise agreed to take a polygraph test. During the test, she was asked if she had caused physical harm to Matthew on that day. She denied causing any injury, and a lie detector expert concluded her answers were truthful with 95% confidence. Another expert, hired by her lawyers, also confirmed that she answered all questions truthfully. On October 7, 1997, a trial began in Cambridge, Massachusetts, involving many medical experts, including neurosurgeons, pediatricians, ophthalmologists, and pathologists, all of whom were familiar with similar crimes. In the courtroom, there was extensive discussion about Matthew's injuries and Louise's behavior. Most experts believed that his injuries were caused by abuse and violence. Many doubted Louise's statement that she had accidentally hit the boy's head, noting that the injuries showed signs of blunt force trauma. The child had probably been severely and brutally beaten, and the injuries appeared fresh. An expert for the prosecution initially compared Matthew's injury to those from a fall from the second floor, but this statement was later withdrawn. The defense argued that Matthew's head and wrist injuries occurred weeks prior to the incident, before the nanny was in their home. The lawyer suggested that the child's parents, Sunil and Deborah, could have been involved in neglect or abuse. In court, Louise stated that she had not noticed any injuries to Matthew's head or arm. She explained that her interaction with the child was mild, but it caused the reopening of an old injury, leading to bleeding. She mentioned that the day before the tragic incident, the child fell near the stairs and hurt himself, which might have aggravated the injury. Louise clarified that her use of British English was misunderstood. When she said popped, she meant she placed the child on the bed, not threw him, as might be interpreted in American English, and she denied dropping the baby in the bathtub. The defense argued that if the prosecution's claim of cruel treatment were true, Matthew would have had serious bruises and hematomas on the head and body, which were not present. This suggests that the child might have been shaken to calm him down, but not to the extent the prosecution claimed. Louise, in an emotional outburst, lost control and shook the child, causing old injuries to resurface. Witnesses and experts testified that there was no fresh bleeding in the brain, indicating that the skull fracture was an older injury. However, Sunil and Deborah denied that Matthew had suffered such a traumatic brain injury. The defense suggested that these actions might have been driven by fear, as Louise panicked while trying to revive the child. Unfortunately, Brendan could not testify at the trial because he was too young to understand what had happened. During the trial, Louise acted inappropriately. She occasionally smirked and laughed, which was attributed to nervous shock. At the time, she was reportedly only 18 years old, and the incident described triggered such a reaction. Additionally, she retracted her initial testimony obtained by detectives during the first interview. She did not mention how challenging it was to work for the Eappen family, who overwhelmed her with childcare and household duties, for which she was unprepared. She had come to the United States to relax and have fun. Despite this, she insisted that she never mistreated the children. She claimed she would never harm a child, especially to the extent of causing serious injuries that led to a coma and could paralyze an 8-month-old baby. Louise's relatives from the UK spoke at the trial, praising her as a gentle and reserved person. They described her as an obedient parishioner of a local church, a vegetarian, and a clarinet player. However, her friends from the US had a different view, seeing her as a party girl who never missed a chance to go out. 3 of her friends testified at the trial, as well as former employers who had let her go due to incompetence and irresponsibility. The prosecution highlighted that she tried to wake Matthew 15 to 20 times but found the boy wasn't breathing. She attempted to help him and called his parents, but they didn't answer. It took her half an hour to finally call 911. The prosecutor questioned why she delayed calling for emergency help when immediate action was needed. She explained that she was panicking and stressed, trying hard to manage the situation on her own. Throughout the trial, Louise showed little emotion. She occasionally smiled but never expressed regret for what happened. She spoke fondly of Brendan and Matthew, she describing Brendan as smart and talkative, and Matthew as a sweet, smiling, and playful child. The trial was broadcast live on British television, capturing the attention of almost the entire country, with many people supporting she. On October 30, 1997, a jury found Louise Woodward guilty of second-degree murder. She begged the judge to lighten her sentence. She begged them not to let her spend the rest of her life in prison for something she didn't do. However, the judge ignored her pleas. Louise was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Upon hearing the sentence, she burst into tears, unable to believe what was happening. She questioned the judge, insisting that she hadn't done anything wrong and sincerely hoped for an acquittal. Her mother supported her, stating in court that a terrible judicial error had occurred. She argued that her daughter could not have harmed a defenseless child and that she was innocent and did not deserve such a harsh punishment. In fact, the jury's opinions were mixed. Many people believe that Louise is innocent in Matthew's death, attributing it to an old injury. However, after further deliberation, the jury concluded she was guilty. It later emerged that those who initially supported acquittal were persuaded to vote guilty. This thing sparked significant public outcry in both the United States and Louise's home country, Britain. Many people in the UK donated funds to assist Louise and her family, totaling about $500,000. Additionally, there were mass protests from supporters who believed Louise was an innocent victim of the US legal system. This public pressure led to the conviction being overturned by the judge 10 days later. By then, Louise had already spent about 8 months in prison. After reviewing the case materials, the new judge concluded that Louise's actions were due to her inexperience and immaturity, not malicious intent, and that murder was not her purpose. Louise was sentenced to the time she had already spent in prison awaiting trial, which was 289 days, allowing her to be immediately released. Her supporters celebrated her release like a holiday. Meanwhile, the death of Matthew, the 8-month-old child, was largely overlooked. Even if his death wasn't her fault, his parents sought justice for their child, and the prosecutor was determined to see Louise imprisoned for a longer period. He noted that he had recently been involved in a trial where a father was accused of killing a child in a similar case, and that father remained in prison. He questioned why Louise, a nanny, was released, viewing it as unfair and contradictory given the prevalence of similar cases in U.S. judicial practice. Louise was released from prison after serving less time than it took. She returned to her hometown in the UK in 1998 and enrolled in the Faculty of Law at London South Bank University. She explained that her interest in law developed during the trial, as she engaged deeply with legal matters to better understand the proceedings. Thus, choosing law as a profession felt natural and obvious to her. While pursuing her studies, Louise decided to fulfill another dream, learning to dance. She took salsa lessons and later opened her own dance school, becoming a dance instructor. Her classes included children, often accompanied by their mothers, who were comfortable with her past and aware of the accusations against her. In 2002, Louise graduated with honors from university and began working as a lawyer. However, a year later, she left her law firm to return to her dance studio. She then married businessman Anthony Elkis, who worked in cargo transportation, and they had a daughter. By 2014, Louise had authored several books and participated in numerous interviews about past incident. In all interviews, she has insisted that she was wrongly accused of Matthew's death. She insisted she had no intention to harm and believed her arrest was unjust. She remarked that the U.S. judicial system often demands accountability, suggesting that if the parents weren't blamed, the suspicion fell on her. Still, she expressed relief and gratitude that the judicial system ultimately resolved the case, leading to her release. Louise, now 45 years old, continues to live a normal life without feeling guilty about the past, and many people support her in this. In one of her interviews, she stated that she had the right to enjoy her life. Meanwhile, the parents of Matthew, Deborah, and Sunil faced public outrage. People criticized them for prioritizing their careers over spending time with their children, questioning why they hired an inexperienced young nanny who was not equipped to care for small children. Despite knowing this, they were attracted because the cost of hiring her would be very low and burdened her with excessive responsibilities. The 18-year-old nanny, Louise, received only 3 days of training before being overwhelmed with numerous restrictions and rules. Due to public pressure, the Eappen family had to relocate to a new, undisclosed address. It is known that they now have 2 more children and no longer hire nannies, with Deborah taking on the responsibility of raising the children herself. They established the Matthew Eappen Foundation at Boston Children's Hospital to enhance child safety and well-being by educating the public about the dangers of shaking a baby and providing support to victims and their families. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Ingrid Line. Ingrid Line was born on August 2, 1975. She lived in Renton, Washington, just outside Seattle, with her 3 young daughters. Ingrid was a nurse at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. She balanced her career with taking care of her young children. After divorcing Philip Line, who was also the father of her children, they agreed to share parenting responsibilities. Although divorced, Ingrid and Philip still maintained a friendly relationship to effectively raise their daughter together. Ingrid's world revolved around her daughters, Noelle, 10, Brooke, 8, and Reese, 6. She was devoted to their safety and happiness, willing to sacrifice whatever was necessary. On April 9, 2016, Philip Line visited Ingrid at their residence in Renton, Washington, in a visit intended to care for their children together. Philip was sure that Ingrid would be home to welcome him. But when he arrived at the house, Philip was unable to reach Ingrid by phone, so he then contacted Ingrid's mother, Jorga, for support. Jorga and Philip entered Ingrid's house using Jorga's key and began searching for Ingrid. They found Ingrid's wallet, phone, and other personal items, including her driver's license, but no sign of Ingrid. It seemed unusual for her to leave without telling anyone. Worried, Jorga decided to report Ingrid missing to the authorities. As the investigation progressed, police spoke to Ingrid's friends and neighbors, eventually learning that she had mentioned going on a date with a man the night before. A neighbor also mentioned that Ingrid had recently started seeing a man named John, which was news to Jorga and Philip. Ingrid and Jorga had previously shared phone accounts, allowing Jorga to access Ingrid's call logs. When reviewing the logs, Jorga discovered that Ingrid had made multiple calls to a number registered in Montana. Jorga became suspicious and looked up the phone number online and discovered it was linked to John Robert Charlton's Facebook account. Concerned for Ingrid's safety, Jorga sent a text message to the number on Saturday, saying she had contacted 911 to report her daughter missing. John Charlton replied, looking surprised and asking what was going on. He explained that he and Ingrid had attended a Mariners game the previous day but then broke up because Ingrid needed to take care of her children early the next morning. Even though Jorge was repeatedly asking him to talk to the police, John Charlton refused to stop responding. The case reached a new turning point on April 9th, when a Seattle resident named Mike Novasio placed an emergency call to authorities. Mike reported that when he returned home, he noticed one of his recycling bins had an unusual weight, which had been left outside for collection on April 7th. Mike had noticed something was wrong and had decided to investigate. When he had opened the trash can, he had been shocked to find 3 clear plastic bags, one of which had appeared to contain human remains, which was why he had immediately called the authorities. When the police and medical examiner had arrived, they had carefully examined the contents of the bags. Inside, they had found a human head, a foot, an arm, and a leg. Although the remains had shown no signs of decomposition, facial features had still been recognizable, allowing them to identify the remains as those of Ingrid. In the following days, more of Ingrid's remains had been found. Some had been discovered at a recycling facility, while others had been found in coolers at another location. Unfortunately, not all of Ingrid's remains had been found. During a search of Ingrid's home, police had found tickets to a Mariners game on her laptop dated April 8th. It had been believed that Ingrid and John had attended the game scheduled for 7:10 p.m. on April 11th. As a result, John had been arrested and taken for questioning. During interrogation, John had admitted knowing Ingrid and said they had been dating for about a month after meeting online. He had usually spent the night at her place. But on this particular night, he hadn't because her children would be home the next day. John had claimed that he had gone to a bar with Ingrid after the Mariners game and then driven back to her home in Renton in her car. He had said he had been very drunk and didn't remember much of what had happened after that. He had remembered having sex with Ingrid and her acting strangely, but his memory of the rest of that night had been unclear. When asked what he had done afterward, John had said he wasn't sure, but he had thought he might have slept on a sidewalk in downtown Seattle and woken up there the next morning. He guessed that Ingrid had dropped him off downtown before leaving. John had told authorities he was struggling with alcoholism and had no fixed residence. A physical examination had been conducted and John's injuries had been documented with photographs. He had had scratches on his left hand and forehead, cuts on his mouth and chin, and scratches on his chest. His ex-girlfriend had said she had seen him on April 9th and had noticed his lip was swollen and injured. John had explained his injuries by saying he had been robbed, but this had aroused suspicion among investigators due to John still having his wallet. Ingrid's car had been found by law enforcement in Belltown, a neighborhood near Seattle, on April 20th. However, this discovery raised a contradiction with John's original statement. John had claimed that Ingrid had dropped him off in downtown Seattle and then had driven back home, but evidence from the car had shown otherwise. Police had discovered trash bags in the car that were identical to the bags containing Ingrid's body parts. 3 fingerprints on the driver's door handle had matched John's, leading to his arrest on suspicion of having killed Ingrid and having stolen her car. John's arrest had been based largely on circumstantial evidence. Despite this, he had pleaded not guilty, and his defense team had argued that there had been no direct physical evidence linking him to Ingrid's murder. Initially denying involvement, John had eventually changed his plea to guilty before the trial had begun. During court proceedings, the prosecution had alleged that John had strangled Ingrid at her home and then had used a pruning saw to dismember her body in the bathtub. John had allegedly dumped Ingrid's body in multiple locations in Seattle. At her residence, police had found a nearly empty package of plastic bags identical to those containing her body. In the bathroom, authorities had discovered a 15-inch pruning saw, suspected to have been the tool used to dismember her body. They had also found human remains underneath the bathtub during their investigation. John had been sentenced to just over 27 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under state sentencing discretion. However, Judge Julie Spector had wanted to impose a life sentence because John's actions had been too serious. When given the opportunity to speak, John had apologized to the court and Ingrid's family and had said that he truly regretted his evil and cruel behavior. John had had a long history of run-ins with the law, including convictions for serious crimes such as aggravated robbery, felony theft, and assault. He had also been arrested for theft. However, it had been his behavior at home that had worried his parents the most. In 2006, John's parents had felt threatened by their son's actions and had obtained a temporary protective order against him. According to court records, John had been struggling with the pressures of life and had been experiencing psychological instability. On March 2, 2006, he had been drunk and aggressive, trying to fight with his parents at his home. His behavior, not only in words but also in actions, had posed a threat to their safety. John's parents had been concerned about his possible cocaine use and his tendency to hold grudges for years. They had also noticed that when he had been drunk or on drugs, he had become scary, making them fear for their safety. One incident that stands out is when John had forced his mother to watch the movie Hannibal and had warned her to watch this and be careful. This behavior had been disturbing and had added to their concerns. Despite initial concerns, John's parents had eventually asked that the protective order be withdrawn. Following Ingrid's murder, the grief experienced by her family and friends had been immense, reflecting the loss of a caring mother, daughter, and friend. In the wake of Ingrid's tragic death, the community had come together to support her family, demonstrating strength through adversity. Ingrid's memory would continue to live on in the hearts of those who had known and loved her. Her story served as a reminder to prioritize safety and caution when meeting people online. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Kelsey Turner. Kelsey Turner was born on March 5, 1993, in Norfolk, Virginia, to Samantha Ingram, a would-be model and dancer, and Christopher Ingram, a laborer. As the second child, she grew up with her older brother Colin. Shortly after her birth, the family moved to Jonesboro, Arkansas, where Kelsey spent most of her childhood. After her parents divorced a few years later, her father returned to Virginia and lost contact with his former wife and children. Kelsey developed into a stunning beauty with a perfect figure, ideal for modeling. She wasn't interested in school, preferring to attend parties, go on dates, and participate in events. Her dream was to become famous, feature on magazine covers, give interviews, and walk the red carpet. Although she lacked talent, her youth and good looks were her biggest assets. In high school, Kelsey began attending modeling castings, with her mother Samantha's strong support. Samantha had once aspired to be a model herself and was enthusiastic about her daughter's endeavors. However, Kelsey only managed to secure a couple of shoots for clothing catalogs. At 18, Kelsey married Judy Turner when she was already pregnant. Shortly after, she gave birth to a daughter named Beverly. However, their marriage was brief and ended in divorce by the time she was 20. After abandoning her runway modeling career, Kelsey decided to pursue a career as a men's magazine model. She created a portfolio featuring provocative photos and submitted them to various publications, which quickly caught the attention of several men's magazines. Kelsey viewed this as the start of a promising career and her path to a glamorous, carefree lifestyle, which she had always aspired to. Over the next few years, she regularly received offers for photo shoots. She enthusiastically gave interviews, attended events, and attempted to establish valuable connections. Notable highlights of her career included one-off shoots for Playboy and Maxim, as well as a photo session and interview with 110 magazine. For these opportunities, she traveled to Los Angeles and Las Vegas. In an interview, Kelsey candidly described herself, stating that she was a blonde with a curvy figure and a slim waist, and asked what more one would need for happiness. She also shared that she enjoyed partying, spending time with friends, and living life to the fullest, believing that life is short and should be lived beautifully and joyfully. Kelsey was not overly concerned about her future, frequently changed partners, and quickly spent the money she earned or received from admirers. At 23, Kelsey had another child, a son named Josh, but the father refused to acknowledge him or marry her. As her modeling career declined, Kelsey turned to social media to build a following. She regularly posted provocative photos of herself in swimsuits, lingerie, and revealing outfits, which were heavily edited to make her look like a Barbie doll. She also shared pictures of herself at trendy boutiques, nightclubs, and popular entertainment venues, creating an illusion of a luxurious and carefree life. However, behind this facade, Kelsey, a single mother of 2 young children, was struggling to make ends meet. She didn't know how to manage her finances wisely and spent all her money as soon as she got it. In 2016, Kelsey faced a serious crisis after an incident involving her daughter, who was left traumatized and became withdrawn and mute, despite being physically unharmed. The incident led to therapy sessions with Dr. Thomas Burchard, a renowned child psychiatrist in Monterey, California, which ultimately contributed to a tragic event years later. Dr. Thomas Kirk Burchard was born in Boston, Massachusetts, on February 16, 1948, to a family of a prominent architect and engineer. His family later moved to Virginia, where his father taught at Harvard and the Architectural College at the Technological Institute. Thomas spent his childhood and youth in Virginia. Unlike his father, Thomas chose a career in medicine, specifically child psychology. After graduating from medical school and completing his thesis, Thomas worked as a pediatric psychiatry resident in several prestigious hospitals and lectured at colleges nationwide. Eventually, Dr. Burchard was employed at a public clinical hospital on the Monterey Peninsula in California, where he worked for over 40 years as a highly sought-after pediatric psychiatrist. Dr. Burchard was a highly respected doctor with a reputation for connecting with his young patients and taking on the toughest cases. He had a doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley, and an impressive academic record with over 300 scientific publications, cited nearly 40,000 times, giving him an H-index of 81. He was also known for his kindness, responsiveness, and generosity, particularly towards his young patients from low-income families. He even paid for hospital treatments for sick children and assisted single mothers. Dr. Burchard lived with a woman named D.Y., who was described as his assistant, housekeeper, lover, or fiancée. She was close to him and the first to notice changes in his behavior, which suggested early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. As he approached his 70th birthday, Dr. Burchard became increasingly forgetful, absent-minded, and inattentive. To cope, he kept detailed diaries and notebooks to record everything, including names, dates, and events, to avoid confusion. He always carried a notebook with him containing sensitive information like banking details, account numbers, passwords, and card pins. Dr. Thomas Burchard's trusting nature led him to increase his financial support to those in need from hundreds to thousands of dollars. Kelsey Turner took advantage of Dr. Burchard's generosity. During her first visit with her daughter, she tearfully told the doctor that as a single mother of 2, she couldn't afford his expensive services. Feeling empathetic, Dr. Burchard offered to treat her child for free and even gave her $300 to help with her children's needs. Kelsey was surprised, but soon realized that by sharing fabricated, tearful stories about her struggles, she could extract more money from the elderly doctor. At their next session, she concocted a performance, tearfully describing her younger son's illness and claiming she couldn't afford his expensive medication. This time, she specified a fake amount, and Dr. Burchard gave it to her in full. Kelsey's luck had changed, and from that point on, she frequently fabricated emotional stories to extract large sums of money from the trusting older man. Instead of using the money to support her children, she spent it on her own leisure activities, luxury clothing, and beauty treatments. Unwilling to return to her hometown in Virginia, Kelsey convinced Thomas to pay for her rental housing in California, claiming it would be easier to find a job and the climate was better for her children. It didn't take much persuasion for the doctor to agree, and he paid for the apartment. There were whispers that Kelsey and Thomas were romantically involved, and that this was the reason the respected doctor accommodated her every request. While these whispers may have held some truth, Kelsey maintained that Thomas had a paternal affection for her and her children, and was helping them selflessly. This was supported in court by Judy, although she added that Kelsey shamelessly took advantage of the doctor's kindness and his declining mental state due to dementia. Thomas paid for Kelsey's rental housing, bills, and gave her large sums of cash for necessities. He also rented a luxurious Mercedes-Benz convertible for her, rather than a practical family vehicle suitable for transporting children safely. As Kelsey's modeling career came to an end, her youth faded, and she stopped receiving offers for photo shoots. But instead of getting a job, she relied on her wealthy benefactor, Thomas, for financial support. Over nearly 3 years, Kelsey tried to break free from Thomas, blackmailing and threatening him. Despite this, he spent around $500,000 on her and her children. However, Kelsey wasted all the money on luxuries, including breast augmentation and liposuction, hoping to revive her modeling career. She prioritized partying over her children, neglecting them in the process. As a result, her ex-husband gained sole custody of their daughter through the court, stripping Kelsey of her parental rights. She was left with only her younger son, whose father had never shown interest in his child. Thomas was furious when he discovered what was happening, not because of the girl's ex-husband, but because of Kelsey's behavior. He realized she was a neglectful mother who didn't care for her children and spent all the money meant for them on her own desires, entertainment, and clothes. Dr. Burchard decided to have a serious talk with Kelsey, telling her he would no longer fund her extravagant and idle lifestyle. In response, Kelsey threatened to spread false rumors that the respected child psychiatrist had inappropriate, intimate interests in his young patients. Although this was a lie, any gossip on the matter could severely damage the doctor's reputation. Reluctantly, Burchard agreed to Kelsey's terms and continued to transfer money and pay her bills. In early 2019, Kelsey decided to move to Las Vegas with her son, intending to revive her modeling career. As usual, she expected Thomas, whom she continued to blackmail, to finance this venture. The doctor rented a house that Kelsey had chosen and transferred the amount of money she requested. After this, Kelsey disappeared for 2 months without giving any sign of her whereabouts. In late February 2019, Kelsey resurfaced because she was running out of money. She called Thomas, crying, and told him about her severe illness, inability to work, and struggle to provide for her son. However, when the doctor refused to help, Kelsey's tone changed abruptly, and she began threatening and blackmailing him again. It's crucial to highlight that Judy had been pushing Dr. Burchard for a while to report Kelsey to the authorities, exposing her blackmail and extortion attempts. Judy also recommended getting Child Protective Services involved, considering Kelsey's past, having already lost parental rights to her older daughter, and her inability to properly care for her young son. Anticipating a potential court case, Dr. Burchard took steps to ensure he had the backing of his colleagues, keeping them informed about the situation and securing their promises of support. To persuade Kelsey to leave Thomas alone, Judy previously tried talking to her directly, but Kelsey responded with threats of retaliation. This time, Dr. Burchard decided to travel to Las Vegas to verify Kelsey's claims, knowing what he would likely find. Judy attempted to discourage him from going, but the elderly man was resolute. She then advised him to bring her or one of his friends along, but Thomas insisted that this was a personal matter that he needed to resolve on his own. Dr. Burchard set out on his journey on March 1st, 2019. On the morning of March 7th, a group of tourists driving through Nevada took a detour from the main highway onto a dirt road leading to Lake Mead. They stumbled upon a solitary Mercedes-Benz convertible parked in the middle of the desert with its windows up and roof closed, but no one in sight. The tourists found this suspicious and decided to investigate. As they approached the vehicle, they noticed one of the windows was shattered. Upon peering inside, they discovered signs of a violent struggle, with bloodstains throughout the interior. The tourists promptly reported their disturbing discovery to the police. Law enforcement officers arrived at the scene around noon, greeted by an overwhelming stench of decay under the scorching sun. The source of the odor was quickly located when they opened the trunk of the car. Beneath a pile of items and rags, they found the lifeless body of an elderly man, next to whom lay a blood-stained baseball bat. It was later confirmed that the body belonged to Dr. Burchard, who had been missing for 5 days. Judy had reported his disappearance on March 2nd, when she couldn't reach him at their scheduled time, and she immediately feared the worst. She contacted the police, hoping against hope that he would be found alive. Tragically, that was not the case. The autopsy revealed a horrific series of injuries on the elderly man's body. He had sustained multiple abrasions, bruises, and superficial cuts. The examination also showed that he had suffered severe head injuries, likely inflicted by the baseball bat found beside him in the trunk. Part of his ear had been severed, and his hands bore numerous cuts, suggesting a desperate attempt to defend himself. Additionally, there were bruises on his face with a peculiar imprinted pattern. The most shocking discovery, however, was that the man had been placed in the trunk while still alive, where he slowly suffocated under the intense desert sun. As the police investigated the crime scene, they discovered that the car was rented in Kelsey Turner's name, making her the prime suspect. Judy provided the authorities with the address of the house where the blonde lived and where the deceased doctor had gone, as it was also rented in his name. However, when the police arrived, they found the house empty. Inside, they noticed scattered containers of cleaning agents and a strong smell of household chemicals, indicating a hasty attempt to erase any evidence of the crime. The house had been occupied by Turner, her 4-year-old son, her new boyfriend John Logan Kennison, and 2 neighbors, Diana Pina and Jeremy Eric. Since they had all fled, they became suspects, as it seemed unlikely that the petite blonde could have inflicted such severe injuries on the doctor or moved his body to the car trunk alone. The police managed to interview Jeremy, who recalled that he and his girlfriend had left the house while the doctor was still alive and unharmed. According to Jeremy, his girlfriend had drunk too much and flirted with the doctor, trying to get a few $100s, similar to Kelsey's tactics. This had enraged Kelsey, who accused the woman of trying to steal her boyfriend. The 2 women almost got into a fight, and Jeremy had to quickly take his girlfriend away from the house. He hadn't returned for several days and was unaware of the subsequent events. Police discovered that Dr. Burchard habitually carried a notebook containing bank account details and passwords, but frequently misplaced it. Following his murder, the notebook went missing, and substantial sums were withdrawn from 2 of his accounts on March 3rd. The authorities promptly blocked the accounts and cards, and on March 21st, Kelsey and her boyfriend J.N. were apprehended in Stockton, California, after a second attempt to withdraw funds. Prior to their arrest, the couple, accompanied by their child, had been evading detection by hiding in motels, constantly changing their location and paying in cash. They later expressed regret for not completely depleting Burchard's accounts initially, and subsequently planned to empty them and flee to Mexico with the money. However, by the time they made their second attempt, the authorities had already blocked the accounts, leading to their capture. According to Diana, after Jeremy and his girlfriend left, a heated argument broke out between Turner and Dr. Burchard. This was triggered by the doctor's refusal to give Turner another cent. In a fit of rage, Turner threatened to ruin Dr. Burchard's reputation by spreading false rumors about his behavior with his young patients. As the situation escalated and Turner became physically aggressive, Dr. Burchard locked himself in a room for safety. However, J.N. forced open the door and violently attacked the elderly doctor with a bat, causing a severe hematoma and a nosebleed. Diana intervened, begging everyone to calm down. Upon seeing Dr. Burchard's condition, she urged them to take him to the hospital, worried about the consequences of their actions. Before they left, Dr. Burchard promised Diana that he would report to the police that he was attacked and robbed by strangers. The four of them then drove to the garage, where Dr. Burchard was seated in the back of the car. Kelsey instructed Diana to return to the house and thoroughly clean up, making sure to remove all traces of blood. Diana started cleaning as told, but heard Dr. Burchard's cries from the garage. Rushing back, she saw Kelsey and Kennison brutally attacking him, trapping him in the car. It was clear they never meant to take him to the hospital, but planned to kill him with a bat and knife. Diana was forced back to cleaning, fearing for her life. Later, she heard the cars drive away, and only Johns returned with Kelsey. From the start, Diana chose to cooperate with the authorities by agreeing to a plea deal, which meant she would reveal everything she knew about the case. In return, she avoided being charged with being an accomplice and received a relatively light 3-year sentence for tampering with evidence. In contrast, her former lovers refused to take responsibility and instead blamed each other for the crime. However, it was easy to prove their guilt because they left behind significant evidence in the car, and phone records showed they were in the desert on the night of March 2nd, where the car with the body was abandoned. Kennison was convicted of second-degree homicide and received a 45-year prison sentence, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. The situation with Turner was more complicated. After her arrest, she announced that she was pregnant, which significantly delayed her trial. While in prison, she gave birth to a girl, and both the newborn and her son were placed in the care of social services because none of Turner's relatives were willing to take on the responsibility. In January 2023, following her lawyer's advice, Kelsey Turner admitted her guilt and was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 10 years from the start of her sentence. She is currently serving her sentence at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Las Vegas. In conclusion, it is worth noting that ABC's documentary series 20th Century aired an episode in February 2023 titled A Model Murder, which detailed the heinous crime committed by Turner and her boyfriend against Dr. Burchard. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Chris Coleman. On May 5, 2009, the Coleman family, who appeared to have the perfect life, was tragically murdered in their home just before 3 a.m. Let's examine the events of that night, a crime that left a lasting impact on many. Chris Coleman met his future wife, Sherry, while they were both serving in the military. For Sherry, it was love at first sight, and she knew immediately that Chris was the one she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Within a few months of meeting, Sherry became pregnant with their first child, Garrett. As devout Christians, the couple married before Garrett was born. After Garrett's birth, Chris and Sherry had their second son, Gavin. Gavin was a lively child, whereas Garrett was more laid back, like his father. Both boys had lively personalities and were well behaved. Sherry was a devoted mother who would do anything to protect her sons. Chris was an excellent father, and the family enjoyed quality time together, laughing, playing, and cherishing every moment with their children. After leaving the military, the Colemans moved to Waterloo, Illinois, a small town, where they bought a house in an upscale neighborhood, courtesy of Chris's new job. Chris became the head of security for Joyce Meyer, a renowned TV evangelist and CEO of one of the world's largest Christian ministries. However, controversy arose due to Joyce's multi-million-dollar income and opulent lifestyle, which sparked criticism from some individuals. They accused her of being a greedy con artist who exploited her followers' fears, arguing that her financial success and lavish lifestyle conflicted with her religious teachings. As Joyce's bodyguard and personal security guard, Chris was responsible for monitoring and protecting her from hate mail and letters sent to her church, which often contained threats against her life, with people expressing their intentions to harm her. Chris earned a substantial salary of $100,000 per year working for Joyce's ministry in St. Louis, Missouri, providing financial stability for his family. As part of his job as a bodyguard, Chris frequently accompanied Joyce on international trips, ensuring his safety while abroad. However, this arrangement meant Chris was away from home for extended periods, affecting his family life. One year, Chris was gone for 260 days, which took a toll on his family, especially his sons, Garrett and Gavin. The boys missed their father and would mark off each day on a calendar, eagerly waiting for his return. However, shortly after Chris came home, he would have to leave again, causing tension in his marriage to Sherry. Sherry felt overwhelmed, shouldering the responsibilities of both parents and underappreciated for managing the household alone. The constant cycle of Chris's absence strained their relationship. In October 2008, Chris visited Tampa, Florida, where his friend Sherry had gone to high school. Sherry got in touch with her old friend Tara Lintz and asked her to look out for Chris while he was in town. After settling in, Chris contacted Tara and they agreed to meet up. Tara kindly showed Chris around the city. On November 14, 2008, at around 11 p.m., Chris received a disturbing email. The sender's email address was destroychris@gmail.com, and the subject line and content terrified him. The email warned Chris to stop working for Joyce Meyer, otherwise he or his family would be killed. Over the next few hours, more threatening emails arrived at the ministry from the same sender, repeating the threat and specifying a time and date when the attack on his family might happen. The sender seemed to know Chris's schedule and was aware that he would soon be traveling out of the country. Chris told Sherry about the threatening emails he'd been getting, and on the following Monday, he went to the local police station to report them. He explained that he'd been away from home a lot lately because he'd been traveling with Joyce Meyer Ministries. The police offered to increase their patrols around the house when Chris was away, but even with the extra police presence, Sherry was still afraid for her family's safety. Sherry was so scared that she once asked a friend to stay with her because she didn't feel safe staying alone in the house when Chris was away. She made it clear that she would do whatever it took to keep her family safe. To prove how serious she was, Sherry showed her friend that she had a gun and demonstrated how to hold it, just in case someone broke into the house while Chris was away and she wasn't there. 2 months after the death threats started, a mysterious hand-delivered letter arrived in the Coleman's mailbox. The letter was written in bold letters and was very demanding. It said, "Deny your God publicly or else. No more opportunities. Time is running out for you and your family." This threat was very ominous and specific, stating that if the Colemans didn't do what the writer wanted, they would face severe consequences. Sherry was deeply shaken by the disturbing message. The fact that someone had invaded her private space and threatened her and her family made her feel genuinely terrified throughout the ordeal. Sherry's fear grew more intense by the day. The letter she received was a constant reminder of the potential danger that lurked in the shadows, waiting to pounce. After getting a death threat in the mail, Sherry and her husband Chris decided to take extra measures to protect their family. As part of their safety plan, Chris installed surveillance cameras around their home. These cameras recorded the surroundings and sent the footage to a screen in their basement office. The footage was also saved on a digital video recorder, allowing Chris to keep a permanent record of any incidents. He hoped the cameras would help him identify the person behind the threats against their family. After the cameras were installed, the threats against the Colemans stopped. Life returned to normal for Chris, Sherry, and their sons, Garrett and Gavin. For a while, everything seemed fine. In April 2009, Sherry confided in others that she was feeling more optimistic about her marriage and was determined to make it work. she was relieved the death threats had stopped and felt a sense of happiness. However, Sherry's optimism was short-lived. A second ominous letter arrived at the Coleman home, warning her that her worst fears were about to become a reality. Chris, her husband, was unsettled by the letter's contents and decided to review the previous night's footage from their security camera. What he saw shocked him. A mysterious silhouette caught his attention, but its identity remained unclear. This new discovery reignited Sherry's fear for her own and her children's safety, plunging her back into a state of constant unease. The brief sense of security she had felt was now gone, replaced by the feeling that her worst nightmare was closing in. The local police boosted their efforts due to the rising threats against the Coleman family. A neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow from the Columbia Police Department, took a keen interest in the case. Detective Barlow personally called Chris to discuss the situation. During their conversation, Detective Barlow mentioned that he had noticed Chris's recent work absences from home. He offered help, providing his cell phone number in case Chris needed anything or had concerns. Detective Barlow reassured Chris that he could respond faster in an emergency than the regular police. Detective Justin Barlow lived across the street from the Coleman family, so he set up video cameras to monitor their driveway over several weeks. Although the cameras captured footage of the Colemans going about their daily routines, they did not capture the person responsible for leaving the death threats. Despite his efforts, the videos did not provide any clues or information about the identity of the person behind the threatening messages. On May 5, 2009, Chris went to the gym at 5:45 a.m. After leaving his house around 5:30 a.m., he called his home phone at 6:45 a.m. to check if his wife Sherry and their sons were up and getting ready for school. When no one answered, Chris became worried and called his neighbor, Detective Justin Barlow, at 6:45 a.m. to ask for his help. Chris explained to Detective Barlow that he had been trying to reach Sherry while he was at the gym, but she wasn't picking up. This made Chris increasingly concerned, so he asked Detective Barlow to check on Sherry and the boys. Detective Barlow prepared himself by grabbing his essential items, including his weapon, handcuffs, flashlight, and radio, before heading to the Coleman residence. While waiting for backup to arrive, his main goal was to make contact with Sherry and ensure everything was okay. With a mix of anticipation and apprehension, Detective Barlow approached the door and knocked firmly, hoping to get a response. However, the silence that followed made him feel uneasy. The lights inside the house were off, and there was no sign of movement, which only added to his bad feeling. Within minutes of Detective Justin Barlow's arrival at the Coleman home, a patrol vehicle pulled up with an additional officer to assist him. The second officer was sent to the rear of the house to try to see through a door or window or establish contact with Sherry or the boys at the back of the house. But as soon as the officer reached the back, he found signs of forced entry into the basement. This discovery immediately grabbed Detective Barlow's attention, and he began to suspect that someone inside the house was in danger. Detective Barlow was deeply concerned for the safety of Sherry Garrett and Gavin after discovering the signs of forced entry into the Coleman home. Detective Barlow and the second officer decided to enter the premises through the basement. They announced their presence, but received no response. As they thoroughly searched the basement, they found a disconnected video cable at the computer desk. This led them to conclude that the camera's digital video recorder had been taken. Detective Justin Barlow and another officer made their way up from the basement of the Coleman home, ascending the stairs to the main level. As they climbed, they noticed an increasingly strong smell of aerosol spray paint. Once they reached the top, they saw that the wall had been spray painted with derogatory messages targeting Chris, Sherry, and their sons. 13 minutes after Chris phoned Detective Justin Barlow, Chris returned home from the gym. The detective told him to wait outside while they searched the house. Chris complied, sitting quietly on the porch without asking questions or trying to enter. Meanwhile, a third officer arrived at the Coleman residence. The three officers knew they had to search the rest of the house for Sherry and her sons. As they went upstairs, they found more hate-filled messages spray-painted on the walls when they reached the second story of the Coleman home. Detective Justin Barlow entered Garrett's bedroom, the oldest son's room, and initially thought he was asleep. But when he got closer, the detective realized Garrett was dead. There were no signs of life, and his body was cold to the touch. Ligature marks around his neck indicated the young boy had been murdered by strangulation. The discovery of Garrett's lifeless body shocked Detective Barlow. In the next room, the second officer found Gavin, but to his horror, the boy was also dead, just like his brother. Gavin also had ligature marks around his neck, indicating he had been strangled. The killer had even spray-painted an obscene message on the bed sheets, making the scene even more horrific. The third officer entered the master bedroom, where he was met with a deeply disturbing scene. Sherry, like her sons, was lying lifeless across the bed, her hair scattered over her face, hiding her features. It was obvious to the officer that Sherry had been brutally murdered. As he surveyed the room, he noticed multiple bruises on Sherry's body, suggesting that she had fiercely resisted her attacker, fighting to defend herself and her sons. After Detective Justin Barlow and the officers discovered the lifeless bodies of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, Chris entered the house, having waited outside for news about his family. Unaware of the gravity of the situation, Chris announced his presence. Detective Barlow then had the heartbreaking task of informing Chris that his entire family had been murdered. This devastating news crushed Chris, leaving him reeling. To give Chris some privacy to process the information, Detective Barlow accompanied him outside. However, as the reality of the situation set in, Chris's reaction was overwhelming. He became nauseous, and his body seemed to weaken. Overcome with grief, Chris curled up in a fetal position, unable to contain the torrent of emotions. The shock of the tragedy was too much for him to absorb. Chris couldn't comprehend the brutal way his family had been taken from him. In desperation, Chris reached out to his father, Ronald, and informed him that something had happened to Sherry and the boys. Ronald immediately realized Chris was in shock upon receiving the news. Ronald was equally stunned, unable to believe that this tragedy had befallen his family. News of the shocking murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman spread swiftly throughout Waterloo, Illinois, where the family lived. As the community awoke to the grim news, neighbors were left devastated and terrified. The Coleman family had always been perceived as the epitome of a perfect American family, with their charming sons, Garrett and Gavin, admired by everyone. In fact, one neighbor went so far as to say that everyone would want their children to be like Garrett and Gavin, who were always polite, helpful, and kind-hearted. For Sherry's brother and mother, the harsh reality of the brutal crime was impossible to accept. Chris Coleman, the husband and father, was taken to a nearby police station for questioning after his wife and two sons were discovered murdered. During the interrogation, Detective Justin Barlow asked Chris if he could shed any light on the killings. Chris expressed deep regret for leaving to go to the gym, leaving Sherry and the boys alone in the home. When Detective Barlow asked Chris if he had any idea who could have committed the murders, Chris claimed he had no idea. However, several aspects of Chris's behavior during the interview raised suspicions with the detective. One of the detective's initial concerns was Chris's lack of curiosity about the circumstances surrounding his wife and son's murder. Given the gravity of the situation, it seemed odd that Chris didn't ask questions about their deaths. Instead, he appeared uninterested in finding out the details. Additionally, the detective noticed that Chris tried to conceal scratches on his arms during the interview. He asked for a blanket, despite the warm room temperature, to hide the injuries. These scratches raised suspicions as the detective knew that Sherry, Chris's wife, had fought for her life. When questioned about the scratches, Chris claimed they resulted from installing a satellite dish the day before. During the police interview, Chris denied having an affair outside of his marriage. However, he admitted to having a close friendship with Tara, a cocktail waitress and high school friend of his wife's who lived in Florida. Chris claimed that his wife wouldn't have approved of their conversations, but he maintained that he had no intention of leaving his wife for Tara. He insisted that he would never consider betraying his family in such a way. A different story unfolded when detectives contacted Tara in Florida. Tara claimed that her relationship with Chris went beyond friendship, alleging a full-blown affair that started in November 2008. She handed over her phone and laptop to the police, which contained convincing evidence of their romance, including emails, explicit photos, and videos they had exchanged. When confronted with Tara's information, Chris confessed to seeing her more frequently than he initially admitted. Further investigation revealed that Chris and Tara had devised a secret meeting system, often coinciding with his work trips for Joyce Meyer. They would secretly meet at these locations, sometimes traveling to exotic destinations like Hawaii to spend time together away from their families. Chris claimed his relationship with Tara wasn't an affair, defining an affair as involving a deeper level of commitment and involvement than they had. However, detectives found contradictory evidence on Tara's phone and computer, including a calendar marked with a wedding to Chris and scheduled vacations, suggesting she believed he would leave his family for her. This evidence raised suspicions, contradicting Chris's assertion that their relationship was casual. Chris's father, Ronald, was shocked by the revelation, but insisted that the affair had no connection to the murders of Chris's wife and son. He described Chris as gentle and non-violent, emphasizing that he showed no signs of aggression. Detectives suspected Chris's affair with Tara was a strong motive for the murders, but their initial investigation found insufficient evidence to press charges. After 6 hours of questioning, Chris was released without charges. Tara was identified as a person of interest in the murders of Sherry Garrett and Gavin. However, detectives cleared her as a suspect after determining she was in Florida on the morning of May 5, 2009, when the family was killed. The Coleman family murders led to one of the largest murder investigations in Illinois history. A task force of 25 detectives was formed to catch the killer. For 15 consecutive days, they worked 20-hour shifts, bringing in experts to assist with the case. A key focus of the task force was tracing the source of the hate-filled emails sent to Chris Coleman. Every threatening email received by Joyce Meyer Ministries in the past year was carefully analyzed, leading the team to locations across the country. Each person who emailed Joyce Meyer was tracked down and interviewed, but none of the individuals who sent those threats seemed to be responsible for the Coleman family's murder. A computer forensic team was called in to investigate the murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin. The detectives wanted to find any digital clues related to the crime, so they began by analyzing the email account, diarist@gmail.com. Their analysis revealed that the email address was created on November 14, 2008, just days before the first email was sent. One of the most significant discoveries made by the team was that the death threats sent to Chris Coleman's family had originated from the same IP address associated with Chris himself. The detectives continued their investigation into the Coleman family's murder by conducting a thorough examination of both the spray-painted messages found at the crime scene and Christopher Coleman's handwriting to gather evidence. They took photographs of the spray-painted messages at the crime scene and collected samples of Christopher Coleman's handwriting. These samples were then sent to a handwriting expert for analysis. After comparing the two samples, the expert concluded that the handwriting matched the spray-painted messages. This finding led the detectives to conclude that Christopher Coleman was the one who wrote the messages on the walls of his home on the day of the murders. A chemical analysis of the spray paint used at the crime scene identified the brand and color as Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red. Investigators learned that Chris Coleman had bought this exact product at a local hardware store just days before his family was killed. One detective contacted the store manager, who confirmed the purchase and identified the specific product as Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red spray paint. This crucial discovery linked Chris Coleman to the same type of spray paint found at the murder scene. During the investigation into the Coleman family's murder, the time of death became a crucial factor. Initially, Chris claimed to have left his home around 5:45 a.m. on May 5, 2009, the morning his family was killed. However, the medical examiner's report showed that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin were killed around 3 a.m., indicating that Chris was at home when his family was murdered. 2 weeks after the bodies were discovered, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution's argument was that the murders were motivated by greed, selfishness, and narcissism, and that Chris had decided to eliminate his family to start anew. In April 2011, Chris Coleman's trial began, with the state accusing him of murdering his wife, Sherry, and their 2 sons, Garrett and Gavin. The prosecution's case was that Chris had killed his family because he wanted to be with Tara Lynn, but couldn't divorce his wife due to the potential loss of his well-paying job with Joyce Meyer Ministries, which did not condone divorce. Conversely, Chris's defense attorney argued that Chris was innocent and that an intruder had entered the home on May 5, 2009, and committed the murders. Exactly 2 years after the devastating murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, Chris Coleman was finally found guilty of the heinous crime. Although eligible for the death penalty, the judge instead sentenced Chris to life imprisonment without parole. This verdict was influenced by the state of Illinois' recent repeal of the death penalty, which was set to take effect just months after the tragic incident. Sherry's loved ones and friends were resolute in keeping her, Garrett, and Gavin's memories alive and sought to do something meaningful to honor them. They decided to raise funds for victims of domestic violence, a cause that deeply resonated with them. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Christy Lynn Mullins was born on August 28, 1960, in Columbus, Ohio. She grew up in a large family with 5 children, living in a quiet neighborhood away from the hustle and bustle of the city. In the summer of 1975, when Christy was 14, she spent most of her time hanging out with her friends and her sisters, and their favorite spot was the pool at the nearby residential complex, especially on hot summer days. Sometimes she also worked as a babysitter, looking after the kids of people she knew. On August 22nd, one of them asked Christy to watch her child until late in the evening. The next day, Christy woke up around noon and began pondering what to do with her birthday, just 5 days away. She was eagerly anticipating it, so time seemed to pass very slowly for her. The day turned out to be extremely hot. Christy decided to go to the pool with her sister Kim to cool off. Kim went in the water while Christy relaxed on a chair. Later, Christy left without saying anything to Kim. Kim then headed home and found her missing. Around 2:30 p.m., a man called 911 to report finding a human body in the wooded area behind the shopping center. He, along with his wife and son, went there to buy a toy for their son. Their son expressed a desire to stroll through the wooded area behind the shopping center before they entered. There was a well-known trail among the trees that led to the river, and overall the place was quite picturesque, so people often went there just for walks. His parents agreed, and they walked along this path into the depths of the forest. As the family was coming back, they noticed something strange happening a few yards off the trail. Upon closer inspection, they saw a man on the ground, leaning over someone and striking them with a piece of wood. The man saw them, got up, and fled. The father approached the spot and discovered a girl on the ground, covered in blood. His wife, who was undergoing medical training, tried to find a pulse on the victim, but was unable to do so. The man ran to the shopping center and called the police from one of the stores. He and his wife provided investigators with a description of the perpetrator: a young, tall, slender man, around 20 years old, with long dark hair down to his shoulders, wearing only jean shorts and boots. Based on their description, the police created a sketch of the suspect and distributed it to patrol officers. The crime scene examination yielded no results. Officers found the piece of wood used as the murder weapon, but they couldn't find anything that could lead them to the perpetrator. It's worth noting that the victim's hands were tied with a telephone cord and her bikini top was pulled down. The t-shirt she was wearing that day was found next to the body, along with her shoes. Despite this, forensic experts didn't find evidence of sexual assault. Investigators speculated that the perpetrator intended to assault her, but something scared him off. Despite the lack of leads, the police quickly realized which direction to focus on. Christie's younger sister revealed that she left the pool with her friend named Carol, so the police went to talk to her. Carol said that on that day, an unknown man called her home, claiming to be a DJ from a local radio station. He said that there would be a cheerleading competition in their town, and the winners would get free tickets to the state fair. The caller claimed that the event would take place behind the shopping center and would start at 1:45 p.m. He told her to wait at the entrance to the trail in the woods where someone would meet her and explain everything. Obviously, this story seemed very suspicious to the police, but there were even more odd details. Carol claimed that initially she decided to go to this event with her sister, but halfway there they ran into Christie and her sister. After a brief chat, Carol invited Christie to go with her, so they left the sisters behind and headed towards the shopping center. They arrived at the entrance to the woods and waited, sitting on the fence, but no one showed up. Sometime later, Carol said she would go to the shopping center to ask for the time. It took only a few minutes, but when she returned, Christie was no longer there. She waited for a while, but no one appeared, so eventually she left. The police found no evidence to support the claim of any cheerleading competitions in town. They assumed that the caller could have been the killer attempting to lure Carol into the woods, or it could have been some prank unrelated to the murder. Either way, they couldn't trace the call, making it impossible to identify the caller. Investigators also noticed a discrepancy in Carol's story. She said she met Christie and her sister on the street while walking to the shopping center. However, Kim insisted that they were at the pool and Carol came to them there. Late that same evening, Christie's mother encountered Carol, who lived just a few dozen yards from their home, and they had a rather strange conversation. Carol began apologizing to the woman and said that things weren't supposed to go this far. She added that she was supposed to be the target and that 2 people were involved in the murder. Shocked, Christie's mother tried to get more details, but Carol refused to continue the conversation and left. She reported this to the police, and they spoke with Carol again, but she claimed she hadn't said anything like that and insisted on the truthfulness of her initial testimony. Later, she was questioned again with a polygraph, and the operator didn't detect any signs of deception in response to important questions. After this, investigators shifted their focus away from Carol and continued searching for other leads. In the following days, as news of the brutal murder spread throughout the city, local residents were gripped by widespread fear, realizing that a dangerous criminal was still at large. The police believed the killer was a local resident, as they knew about the trail behind the shopping center. Detectives deployed all their resources to find the culprit, and 3 days after Christie's murder, there was a long-awaited breakthrough in the case. Around 5 p.m., a police officer was patrolling the center streets of Columbus when he spotted a man who remarkably resembled the sketch of Christie's killer. The patrol officers immediately contacted the detectives, who quickly arrived at the scene. They asked the man to go with them to the station to answer a few questions, and he agreed. He turned out to be 25-year-old Jack Carmen. Despite the fact that he voluntarily agreed to answer their questions, the police immediately faced a problem. The man had a significant intellectual disability. His IQ, according to various tests, was estimated to be around 50 points. Jack was under the care of a specialized medical institution and lived in an apartment provided by a non-profit organization where he worked. He couldn't read, write, and spoke poorly, but the detectives on Christie's case couldn't ignore the striking resemblance between him and the composite sketch. The interrogation proved to be very challenging. For most of the time, Jack responded to the detectives' questions with a single word or remained silent. The detectives also began to doubt whether he was fully capable of understanding and comprehending the meaning of their questions. The interrogation lasted for 6 hours, but eventually, the detectives made some progress by asking the most simple and straightforward questions possible. They were able to obtain the long-awaited confession from Jack. According to his account, on that day, he left his apartment and took a bus to the shopping center to purchase pants and a shirt. As he walked through the parking lot towards the entrance, he noticed Christie sitting on the fence near the start of the trail leading into the woods. He approached Christie, grabbed her, tied her hands, and dragged her into the woods, where he assaulted her. After that, Christie tried to escape, and that's when Jack caught up with her. He grabbed a piece of wood from the ground and struck her multiple times on the head. Then, he ran to the main road in front of the shopping center and jumped on a bus. The next day, the police took him to the forest, and Jack pointed out the spot where he committed the crime. He also provided investigators with details that only the perpetrator could know, such as the fact that the piece of wood broke in half when he struck the victim with it. The detectives also lined up several people, including Jack, and asked the couple who found Christie to identify the person they saw that day. Both pointed to Jack. He was charged with several offenses, including assault and murder, despite the fact that experts didn't find any evidence of sexual assault. Jack confessed to it, so the prosecution decided not to exclude it. The prosecutor sought the death penalty, but Jack's lawyer, with his consent, struck a deal. Jack had to admit his guilt before the judge and receive a life sentence instead of execution. Considering the high-profile nature of this case, with thousands of people following it, the judicial process moved swiftly. Jack was sentenced to life imprisonment just 11 days after the murder, on September 3rd. However, after the trial, many began to doubt Jack's guilt. As more details about his confession and his personality emerged in the media, more people started to question whether he could have truly committed such an act. Those who knew Jack initially found it hard to believe, as he was described as passive, timid, and compliant, someone who would easily acquiesce to any demands made of him. There were also doubts about Jack's ability to confess to the crime. He could barely speak, yet the police claimed that he had told them about the crime in utmost detail. Those who knew Jack believed that the investigators had simply fed him all the necessary information. They just needed to ask leading questions that already contained facts about the case. For example, did he strike the victim with a piece of wood? And if Jack answered yes, the police could already use it as a confession. One woman who was involved in Jack's treatment added that under threat, he could confess to anything. It was enough for him to hear that he faced the electric chair, and he would do whatever the detectives asked. But that's not all. Supporters of Jack's innocence found out that the police had brought him to the murder scene at the same time as the witnesses, the same married couple who later identified him among other people at the police station. So they had already seen Jack and knew that he was a suspect. The police had claimed that the witnesses didn't cross paths with Jack, but no one believed it. There were many more facts that raised strong doubts about Jack's involvement. For example, the police couldn't find the bus driver or even a single passenger who saw Jack on the way to the city center, according to his own confession. The most significant factor was the testimony of several people in the charity organization building where Jack lived and worked. They claimed to have seen him around 1:30 p.m. If he was indeed there, he had absolutely no chance of taking a bus to the shopping center on the outskirts of the city and committing the murder by 1:50 p.m. Even if he had left immediately after being seen by the witnesses, the bus would take at least 40 minutes to cover that distance. These facts made many people not just doubt Jack's guilt, but come to the conclusion that the police had essentially coerced his confession. Even Christie's parents started to doubt that he was the real killer. On September 9th, just 6 days after the verdict, around 70 people gathered in front of the City Hall to draw attention to the case and demand a thorough investigation. They formed a public committee with the goal of seeking justice. Thanks to this, Jack found a new lawyer who quickly filed for a case review. Several months later, a judge revoked Jack's confession and ordered a new trial. Now the prosecution had to prove his guilt practically from scratch, which seemed like an almost impossible task. While preparations for the new trial were underway, Christie's father, Norman Mills, conducted his own investigation from the beginning. He didn't believe the detectives, thinking they weren't doing enough to find his Christie's killer. He decided not to rely on the police and started searching for answers himself. Soon after the murder, he and some neighbors went to the woods to inspect the area. There, they found jean shorts and blood-stained men's underwear, which they handed over to the police, who had initially overlooked them. However, it remained unknown whether these items were linked to the case or even tested. The new trial for Jack began only in 1977, 2 years after the murder. The defense had two main tasks: to prove Jack's innocence and to try to identify the real killer. They already had a strong candidate for this role, whom they considered the most likely suspect, the man who found Christie's body with his wife, Henry Newell, who was 25 years old at the time of the murder. By the start of the trial, Jack's lawyers had gathered an impressive list of reasons to suspect Henry for the murder, and during the trial, this list grew even longer. Initially, Henry drew attention because of his criminal record, starting from his teenage years, with numerous arrests for various offenses and 3 prison terms, from which he had successfully escaped twice before being caught and sent back. At the time of Jack's trial, he was serving his 4th sentence, this time for setting his own house on fire to collect insurance money. The lawyers reviewed the evidence in Christie's case and found several suspicious details in Henry's testimony. He said he found her body, approached it, and threw aside a piece of wood stained with blood, explaining that he was in shock. However, this action still seemed strange, as it was unclear why he would pick up the murder weapon and throw it away from the body without an apparent reason. He also claimed that he thought Christie was still alive, so he took off his shirt and pressed it to her face, which raised doubts about whether he genuinely tried to stop the bleeding or if his shirt became stained with blood during the murder and he needed to justify it somehow. Jack's lawyers found a store employee in the mall where Henry ran to call the police, who said he wasn't wearing a shirt but had jean shorts on, although by the time the police arrived, he was already wearing different pants. The employee also claimed Henry had a fresh bruise on his face, as if someone had hit him, but when asked why she didn't immediately tell the police about this, she said no one simply asked her, and the officers themselves should have noticed the bruise, but ignored it back then. Henry's neighbor said he saw Henry with fresh scratches on his hands the night of the murder. The neighbor also saw a phone cord in Henry's garage, matching the one used on the victim. Additionally, Henry had told the neighbor a strange story about knowing Carol's 14-year-old friend and swimming naked with her, which was shocking given Henry's age. Henry's wife, Pam, also testified in court, saying everything had happened exactly as they told the police on the first day they went to the mall, and their son wanted to take a walk. Pam added that up until that point, Henry had been at home and only stepped out for a few minutes to chase away the neighborhood kids who had started throwing firecrackers into their yard. Carol Christie also testified, stating that she had never met Henry. Henry himself was also brought into the courtroom from prison, where he repeated his story without any changes and insisted that he had nothing to do with the crime. One of the most significant moments of the trial was the display of the full recording of Jack's interrogation. After viewing, which it became apparent to everyone that Jack was simply coerced into confirming the detective's words that he had committed the murder. Jack barely spoke and apparently didn't fully understand what the police wanted from him. On the fifth day, another unexpected witness appeared, Bobby, Henry's stepson. His testimony truly shocked everyone. Following the case, the boy revealed that on that day, Henry did indeed leave the house to chase away kids throwing firecrackers in their yard. However, he was gone for more than just a few minutes, as his mother had claimed, but for over half an hour. When Henry returned home, his shirt and sandals were missing, and he had scratches on his arms and face. Henry called Pam into another room where they had a conversation, after which they came out and told Bobby that they were all going to the shopping center. Upon arriving, the parents immediately led him to the trail behind the shopping center. The boy claimed that he hadn't asked to go there for a walk, as his parents had initially stated. They entered the woods and almost immediately found Henry's sandals, one of which was torn. Further, they saw Christy's body, and his mother instructed Bobby never to tell anyone about what he saw. The boy added that he only decided to tell the truth after having a conversation with his biological father, who had convinced him to do the right thing. His grandmother also testified in court and recounted one strange episode involving Henry. She, along with him and Pam, attended Christy's farewell ceremony, and on the way back, the woman said what a tragedy it was, and Henry suddenly replied, "It will teach her to keep her mouth shut." Another witness was Henry's friend, who said that Henry once confessed to him that he killed Christy. He added that the killing was accidental, not planned. In the end, this trial left practically no doubt that Jack had no involvement in the crime, and eventually, all charges against him were dropped. However, here's where it gets interesting. Despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to Henry's involvement, the prosecutor stated that he had no intention of pursuing a case against him. He also noted that the initial investigation was conducted in the best possible way. However, the prosecutor pointed out that the police either failed to notice or ignored a vast amount of clues and evidence available to them from day one. His response sparked a wave of public outrage, and 2 days later, the prosecutor had to backtrack and agreed to reopen the investigation into Christy's case. But there was a serious problem. Investigators relied on the initial investigation, including the testimonies of Henry and Pam. In other words, the police still operated under the assumption that the couple stumbled upon Christy's body in the woods with a long-haired, shirtless man looming over her. For this reason, investigators stated that they would be looking for new suspects resembling Jack. Of course, such an approach yielded no results. The investigation continued for several months and eventually went cold. Christy's father never gave up on seeking justice, and once he filed a civil lawsuit against Jack, the reasons for such a move were not as simple as it might have seemed. The man didn't believe in Jack's involvement in the murder, but this legal process would have granted him access to the case files, giving him the opportunity to collect all the available information. Unfortunately, this also yielded no results. In 2006, Christy's father passed away from cancer, never having closure in the case. For a long time, there was no progress in the investigation of Christy's murder until 2013, when former attorney John Aller took an interest in the case. He decided to conduct his own investigation, reaching out to all involved parties, hoping to find new leads. Christy's relatives handed him a box containing all of her father's records, which he had been gathering up until his death. He went through it all, spoke to dozens of people, and it became evident to him that the culprit behind this murder was none other than Henry. During his investigation, he found out that Christy's friend Carol was into smoking marijuana at the time. Digging deeper, he uncovered something else and concluded that she, like some other teenagers, apparently was buying it from Henry. This became another link between him and Carol and could indicate the real reason why Christy went to that forest. He theorized that the whole story about the DJ was simply made up and that, in reality, Carol arranged to meet Henry in the forest to buy the illegal substance. Perhaps she decided to invite Christy along under some other pretext, such as using the same story about the DJ in a cheerleading competition. Another, much darker version suggested that Carol may have initially lured Christie there at Henry's request, who had planned to assault her. However, Christie fought back, as evidenced by the scratches and bruises on his body, and the man killed her. By that time, Henry had committed even more crimes, including domestic violence and assault. There was another incident linked to him, but he wasn't tried for it. The death of his wife Pam in 1982 was particularly concerning. Pam had filed for divorce, and just a month later, she was found dead in their apartment where she still lived with Henry. The official cause of death was a sleeping pill overdose, and the police found a note indicating that she had taken her own life. However, Pam's relatives didn't believe this version and suspected that Henry had tampered with the pills. The stranger part of this whole story was that no package of sleeping pills was found in the apartment, even though Pam obviously couldn't have disposed of it after taking such a large amount. That same year, in 2013, when the case was taken on, Henry passed away from cancer at the age of 63. Despite this, the investigators continued their work and released a book containing all available information about Christie's murder. The release of the book sparked a new wave of interest in the case, and Christie's relatives, along with other people, began demanding to reopen the investigation. Several of Henry's relatives also reached out to the investigators, stating that their entire family knew that he was the one who killed Christie, but had kept silent. One of them recounted that a few months before her 16th birthday, Henry had given her a car as a gift. They went for a ride together, and at some point, he asked her to stop, looked at her, and said that he had killed Christie, detailing the crime in full. The woman said she couldn't believe it, as she thought Henry had simply made up this story under the influence of alcohol. However, after reading the investigator's book, everything fell into place for her. This led to the reopening of the murder investigation in May of 2014. For many months, detectives re-examined all the available evidence, interviewed dozens of people, and re-evaluated the leads. In his confession to his relative, Henry mentioned that he had assaulted Christie. At the time, medical experts found no evidence of that, but now, with modern technology, they re-examined Christie's clothing and found traces of semen. Unfortunately, the traces were so small that conducting DNA analysis was simply impossible. The investigation continued until the end of 2015, when detectives called a press conference. 40 years after the murder, they finally announced that they have no doubt that Henry was the one who committed it. However, since he was no longer alive, they couldn't take this case to court. It was officially declared solved, and the investigation was closed. Without Henry's confession, investigators couldn't be 100% sure of exactly what had happened, but they had a strong idea. Most likely, when Henry had left home that day, he went to the trail behind the shopping center. Perhaps Carol invited him there so she could buy weed, but that part cannot be confirmed. Once there, he saw Christie alone and decided to assault her. He tied her hands with a phone cord and took her further into the woods, where she fought back. Christie managed to scratch him and hit him in the face, after which Henry likely knocked her down and killed her with a piece of wood he had found nearby. He then returned home, told his wife what had happened, and they both came up with a plan for him to avoid punishment. It's worth mentioning that Carol never told the truth after all these years. It's possible she was somehow involved, and we can't exclude that one day she'll come forward. During the press conference, the police also apologized to Christie's family for how negligently their predecessors had handled the case. There was enough evidence from the beginning to charge Henry with the murder, but the investigators either didn't notice it or simply ignored it. Hello friends, welcome to Out Channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Caitlin Poirier. On January 12, 2023, CBS News Minnesota broadcasted a 24-second clip regarding the passing of Donald Blum, an elderly man with gray hair. He died on January 10, 2023, at the age of 73 due to natural causes associated with aging. Who exactly was this person who became the subject of the news report? Donald Blum was a well-known figure, known for his violent and criminal activities. He was sentenced to life in prison, and despite his crimes, he met a natural end. Blum's death marks the end of a long tale of violence and wickedness that initiated back in the 1970s. His string of crimes culminated in the brutal killing of Kathy Poirier. Despite his history of violence, Blum managed to escape justice for many years until a chance encounter resulted in his arrest and subsequent punishment. His criminal activities commenced in 1975 when he abducted a young girl, assaulting her and locking her in his car trunk. The girl, however, managed to escape and inform the authorities. Blum was eventually convicted, yet his punishment was considered lenient. By 1978, after gaining his freedom, he committed aggravated assault once more. In 1983, he faced charges of criminal sexual conduct yet again. He also terrorized two young girls in a secluded area with a knife, binding them to a tree, gagging them, and choking one repeatedly before stopping each time, continuing to make threats. The girls were rescued when a passing police patrol noticed their car parked incorrectly and swiftly investigated. Blum escaped into the woods and changed his appearance by dyeing his hair. However, his efforts were in vain, as he was apprehended 2 months later when one of the girls identified him. Blum admitted to committing the crime, but the punishment he received did not succeed in rehabilitating him. In 1992, a psychologist predicted that without close supervision, Blum would return to behaving in an antisocial manner, which was later confirmed by his actions. Despite changing his name, finding employment, and getting married, Blum accumulated 6 felony convictions by May 1999, mostly involving kidnappings and violence. To understand the origin of this cruelty and desire to control others in an average individual like Donald Blum, we must explore his troubled upbringing. Donald Alban Blum was born on February 5, 1949, in Minnesota and held American citizenship. His childhood was marked by abuse from his father that persisted from a young age into his teenage years. Early signs of heavy drinking and behavioral problems emerged during his school years, with school attendance becoming irregular when he reached 10th grade. The trauma from his tumultuous relationship with his father likely contributed to his behavioral issues and alcohol abuse, especially during adolescence. Examining the story from a mentally healthy perspective allows us to trace how the series of events may have led to Donald's actions. On May 26, 1999, Caitlin Poirier disappeared while working alone during the night shift at a convenience store linked to a service station. Surveillance footage showed a large man dressed in jeans, a backwards baseball cap, and a New York Yankees jersey with the number 23, taking Caitlin out of the store around 11:40 p.m. Catherine Harnick, who works at a Subway restaurant near the convenience store where Caitlin went missing, was interviewed by the police. She mentioned seeing a man behaving strangely just before their store closed at around 10 p.m. Later, as she was driving home, she coincidentally saw the same man leaving the convenience store. This series of events highlights how critical moments can eventually lead to actions influenced by deep-rooted trauma and unresolved issues. Harnick noted that the unknown man was driving a black Ford F-150 pickup truck with a cab and white markings on the side. The truck circled the maintenance area several times before heading towards Moose Lake and stopping in the parking lot of a local cafe. She also observed that Kathy's car was still in the parking lot when she left work. Based on her description and partially recovered surveillance camera footage, a rough sketch of the suspected kidnapper was created. The individual was described as having long blonde hair and appearing to be around 25 years old. A composite sketch, based on information from 4 witnesses, was shared on local TV and in newspapers to gather more information. Hundreds of people from across the state joined in the search for Kathy Poirier in the wooded area near the station. Despite efforts with service dogs and helicopters, no trace of her was found. Posters of Kathy were circulated in newspapers and on billboards across the region, turning her disappearance into a high-profile case. The nearby sex offender facility confirmed that all inmates were present, ruling out the possibility of a kidnapping by an escaped offender. Police started searching for the vehicle using its license plate number and identified Donald Blum as a potential suspect. However, the truck in his driveway was white. The official search for Kathy ended on June 6, 1999, without success. However, many volunteers continued their efforts, hoping to find her. Investigators believed that someone might have seen something that could help make a connection and bring her home. They noted that the person who kidnapped Kathy might have made a mistake by taking her from a store with security cameras. Searchers focused on the neighborhood itself because if the perpetrator was familiar enough to return to the area twice at night, then someone might have seen him before. A search headquarters was set up at the Lutheran Church in Moose Lake, where staff members processed leads and volunteers distributed flyers about Kathy. Despite extensive efforts and optimism from many involved in finding her, Kathy was never found. Speculation arose that the kidnapper could be an athlete or a New York Yankees fan, so police sought help from sports figures. After 2 weeks with no results, the police asked Minnesota Twins legend Paul Molitor to make a public service announcement. His appeal caught the attention of Darryl Brown, who worked at the Minnesota Veterans Home. On June 18th, Brown called the hotline to report his co-worker Donald Hutchinson, who had similarities to a composite sketch and had recently changed his appearance. Investigation revealed that Donald Hutchinson was actually Donald Blum. He had a black pickup truck hidden in his garage and owned property near the store where Kathy worked. Further digging showed that Blum had previously been convicted of sex crimes, including kidnapping young girls like Kathy. Investigators quickly obtained a search warrant, and agents from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension located Blum and his family at a campground 140 miles away from Richfield. They woke him up early in the morning to question him. Blum was taken in for further questioning, where it was discovered that he had bought property in Moose Lake around 2 years ago. Neighbors confirmed his frequent visits before Katie's disappearance, mentioning he had not been seen there since. Blum's supervisor at the Veterans Home claimed to be unaware of Blum's criminal history as he went by the name Hutchinson. The supervisor noted that Blum was reserved and not very sociable. Following his arrest, Donald Blum initially cooperated but later chose not to testify and requested legal representation. Authorities led searches which led to the seizure of various items from Blum's residence, although there was no official statement regarding these items and their relevance to the case. An extensive search was conducted on Blum's 20-acre Moose Lake property, involving over 100 National Guard members and hundreds of volunteers who ventured deep into the woods from his land. Though they had to stop as night fell, they resumed their efforts the following morning. Vigor and Katie's mother expressed optimism about finding her daughter, some believing she might be held against her will. However, the sheriff was less hopeful. On the second day of the search, investigators found bone-like fragments among ashes in a fire pit on Donald Blum's property. These fragments were sent for further testing, confirming their origin as bone fragments. A tooth found in the ashes was sent to odontologists for examination. Dr. Norlander, a certified forensic dentist, performed a thorough examination of the tooth, knowing that DNA from the pulp would likely be destroyed. While examining, she found something that looked like a filling, which confirmed it was a human tooth. This helped her determine if it could have belonged to Katie. Dental fillings are made up of an organic matrix and an inorganic filler. The organic part burns away, but the filler particles remain. Analysts can then identify a specific brand or at least a group of potential brands, since manufacturers use up to 50 different types of fillers, each of which shows up distinctly on dental x-rays. The composition of the filling from Blum's fire pit matched the one used for Katie's teeth. Furthermore, researchers were able to identify it as tooth 18 and deduced that it belonged to a young woman. The likelihood that it was Katie's tooth and not someone else's from the area was very high. One major question remains unanswered. Why was the perpetrator released from prison after kidnapping 7 different girls? If the justice system had functioned properly, Katie might still be alive. Instead, Blom managed to change his name, escape his criminal history, find a job, get married, and assume a new identity, all of which allowed him to continue causing harm. In Katie Poirier's case, Blom was accused of kidnapping and illegal possession of a firearm, a federal offense due to his prior convictions that prohibited him from carrying firearms. He initially declined a plea deal, but later changed his mind, agreeing to testify under certain conditions that allowed him to call his family. On September 8th, Blom made a tearful confession that lasted 2.5 hours. He confessed that on May 26, 1999, he went fishing and then drove back to his home in Richfield later that evening. However, he returned to his home on Moose Lake afterward. On the way, he stopped to buy alcohol and have a drink at a bar. He saw Kathy in the store while she was working. Even though he didn't know her, he grabbed her, forced her into his pickup truck, and took her to his motorhome. Blom explained that he was unsure whether his actions stemmed from guilt, feeling foolish, or another reason, but he eventually strangled and killed her. He strangled her from behind, taking approximately 20 minutes. He denied any other form of assault. After realizing she was deceased, Blom placed her in a fire pit in a fetal position, gathering wood and paper to ignite the fire. Blom's version of events contradicted video footage and evidence found at the burn pit. He claimed Kathy had asked multiple times to be released, although she did not resist until he began choking her on his property. He maintained that he was able to end her life using only his hands. Blom's description of burning the body seemed implausible, as wood and paper alone couldn't generate enough heat to reduce a human body to ashes. When pressed, he admitted that none of it made sense to him. He couldn't explain why he did it. At the end of the interview, Blom contacted 2 local TV stations to confess his actions and requested that his family be left alone by the media. As part of the agreement, confiscated property was returned to his wife Amy Blom, including land on Moose Lake, a residence in Richfield, and the family vehicle. For the Poirier family, the confession was devastating, as they had hoped Kathy was still alive. Blom now asserted that she had been murdered and cremated without any discernible motive apart from an inexplicable nighttime impulse. Shortly after, Blom retracted his confession, attributing it to stress from solitary confinement and medication-induced hallucinations that led him to believe confessing was his only escape from his cell. Consequently, the plea deal was revoked as both sides' legal teams prepared for trial. False confessions manifest in various ways. Sometimes, individuals confess to crimes they didn't commit spontaneously. This can occur in response to high-profile cases. Some people succumb to intense interrogation pressure and confess quickly. Additionally, there's a phenomenon where individuals internalize police accusations and come to believe they were involved in crimes they didn't commit. Blom may have admitted to lying under oath or taken back his statement, leaving the decision to the jury. The trial of Blom commenced in June 2000 and involved an extensive jury selection process lasting 5 weeks, followed by 5 weeks of trial proceedings. More than 50 witnesses, including key individuals, were summoned to testify. The case was presented by Thomas Perler, the assistant prosecuting attorney of Carleton County. Initially, Blom's brother testified that he had given their family a box of old clothing, which included a New York Yankees jersey. This revelation was crucial, as Blom had previously denied owning such a garment. Testimonies from 2 women who were kidnapped by Blom in 1983 were particularly damning. They shared their experiences at his hands, shedding light on his behavior towards them when they were young girls, similar to Kathy. Forensic dentists later confirmed that a particular tooth found matched Kathy based on age, gender, and dental records. Expert witness Dr. Ann Norlander initially had doubts about the tooth's identity, but eventually testified with reasonable medical certainty that it belonged to Kathy, based on specific chemicals in the filling material. Additional proof came from surveillance footage from a different store captured in May, showing Blom around the time of Kathy's abduction. His hair, originally gray with blonde tips, verified by his barber, gave him a more youthful look. A pivotal moment in the trial was when Blom's confession was presented in court, with each juror receiving a transcript for examination. The courtroom was filled with the quiet sobs of Kathy's relatives, indicating the strong case against Blom. On August 7th, the lead defense attorney, Rodney Broden, introduced his first witness, Amy Blom, who claimed that her husband was home on the night of Kathy's disappearance. She mentioned recalling seeing a news broadcast the following day about the girl's vanishing act. Amy brought attention to the fact that Katie's disappearance happened near their country house on Moose Lake, which is 110 miles away from their home. Amy considered Blom a suspect due to his criminal record. However, she later recalled his whereabouts on the night prior. Blom had returned home at 9:30 p.m., and by the morning, Amy found coffee ready and saw his spouse at home while they were in bed. Amy mentioned how she felt bullied by the police officers who threatened to take her children if she did not comply with their questioning. She expressed frustration at being called a liar. Moreover, Amy denied ever receiving a baseball jersey from her son-in-law and claimed to have never seen her husband wearing one. During her testimony, Blom was visibly emotional, wiping his eyes in distress. On August 10th, he took the stand to defend himself under oath, denying accusations of kidnapping Kathy Poirier. He spent over 3 hours on the stand, alternating between speaking and crying. Blom portrayed himself as a man in turmoil, claiming his life was in shambles and he was unwell during that period. While he initially confessed to the crime to investigators, Blom later stated that he recanted the confession. He insisted that on the night of the crime, he was at home with his wife, as she had told him, despite being at Moose Lake for fishing earlier in the day. Blom arrived home at 10 p.m. that evening, before Katie was taken. During cross-examination, he had to acknowledge the lies and inconsistencies in his initial statements to the police at the start of the investigation. His courtroom appearance did not sway opinions in his favor, as many perceived him as trying to evade responsibility by portraying himself as a victim. After the questioning ended, Blom seemed frustrated. He turned to the judge, cursed, and asked if he could make one final statement. When the judge denied his request, the case was handed over to the jury. They deliberated for 10 hours, spending 3 hours replaying taped confessions. Ultimately, the jury found Donald Blom guilty, sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Blom maintained his innocence, declaring, "I never killed anyone." He was confident that he had a strong case for appeal. Despite his belief, in 2004, the appeals court upheld his conviction in an 81-page ruling. While acknowledging that his trial was not perfect, the court deemed it fair and saw no reason to overturn the verdict or order a new trial. The murder of Caitlin Poirier resulted in the enactment of Katie's Law. This legislation involved the creation of a statewide computerized crime-fighting network and stricter regulations for monitoring predatory sex offenders like Blom.